Hello, and welcome everyone to the Intrepid Museum's live virtual programming and our live Snacking in Space program, too. So, thanks so much for joining us. We are so glad that you're here tuning in today. I hope you're hungry because today we are going to be talking about space food. That is right, my friends. We are going to chat about the evolution of food up there in space from cubes and tubes all the way to shrimp cocktail and freshly baked cookies. So, my name is Alicia, and I'm an educator at the Intrepid Sea, Air, and Space Museum in New York City. And I'll be your host today. And just a quick reminder that the museum's live streams are free. And if you'd like to help to support us in delivering this content, please do click on the link that you can find in the comments or in the description below. Also, feel free to use the chat today. You can say hello. You can let us know where you're tuning in from. And also, let us know if you've ever been to the Intrepid before or if you plan on visiting us sometime soon. Now, at the museum, our mission is to honor our heroes, educate the public, and inspire our youth. And if you're new to the Intrepid, well, here it is. So, we are located in a historic World War II aircraft carrier, the USS Intrepid. It was constructed way back in 1943, and now it is docked right off the shoreline of Manhattan on the Hudson River. So maybe you have visited us before, or maybe you're looking forward to visiting us in the future. But either way, if you are in the neighborhood, it is kind of hard to miss. The Intrepid is so massive that if you were to stand it up on its end, it would actually be taller than a New York City skyscraper. And it's also so long that you could play 3 games of football on it at the exact same time. So definitely something that you will not miss if you are driving down the highway there. Now, the Intrepid served in 3 wars: World War II, the Cold War, and the Vietnam War. And it was then retired back in 1974 before becoming a museum in 1982, the Intrepid Sea, Air, and Space Museum. But sometimes visitors say, okay, I get why you're a sea museum, get why you're an air museum. Why are you a space museum? That doesn't make any sense. So let us recap. We are, of course, a sea museum because we are a naval ship. In fact, the giant artifact on display on the right there might bring that to life a little bit more for you. That is a propeller that you see there. In fact, one of the 4 that were on the Intrepid that pushed it through the water. But of course, there's a few different kinds of propellers as well. Here's another type of propeller that you might see while you're at the Intrepid on the front of this airplane. So this is, of course, part of why we are an air museum. The Intrepid carried a number of airplanes. In fact, it could fit up to 100 on board at any given time. And it also had the ability to launch and land the planes, too, just like you might do at an airport. So we like to say that it is basically a floating airport, an aircraft carrier is. So this plane, again, is the Avenger from World War II. Later on, we also had jet planes like the Fury here. Those were around later on in the Cold War. They moved a lot faster. And of course, we also had helicopters, which were used to rescue people from the ocean, too. So, all right, clearly we are an air museum because we've got a lot of airplanes, we've got a lot of helicopters, but we're still not really sure about space. Well, I want you to take a look at this thing. Does anyone know what this is? We are looking at this black kind of light bulb shaped thing. It says United States on it. There's a flag, United States flag. Some people say it kind of looks like it might be an ice cream cone tilted on its side. Or I've also heard, a megaphone like somebody shouts into. So tell me in the chat if you happen to know what this is. This is a very, very special vehicle. And it means a lot to us for a few reasons that I'll tell you in a little bit. But this, everyone, is something called a space capsule. And it is the thing that takes astronauts up into space. Now, capsules ride on the very top of a rocket. Of course, the rocket is that very powerful thing that thrusts it up into space. There's lots of flames and fire that comes out of the bottom, right? But once they get up into space, those capsules separate from the rocket, and then the rocket comes back down, and the capsule will continue to float around in outer space. Now, why space, right? So in the 1960s, during the Cold War era, NASA, our space program, was part of something called the space race. So just like it sounds, we were in a race against the Soviet Union to get to space and a bit further. When you're in a race, there's always a finish line, right? So the ultimate finish line of this race was to see which country could get all the way to the moon first. But of course, there's a few other little steps you have to take before you get there. It's not just like, poof, you're on the moon. You have to, of course, figure out first how to launch that rocket. right? You got to figure out then once you're in space, how you can breathe up there, how you can work and how you can sleep over long periods of time, right? You're up there for like 2 weeks at a time. Then there's also things like docking your spacecraft, landing on the moon, all these things. And of course, also eating. But we're going to get to that in just a second. So those capsules were part of some of these very early missions. This is what we call Project Mercury. And this is really just to see if people could even reach outer space and survive up there for a while. So this is a replica, one of those early capsules called the Mercury Aurora 7 we have on display here. Let me know in the chat, just take a look at it. How many people do you think can fit inside of this capsule? Take a guess for me. But while you're doing that, I'm also going to tell you about how it got its name. So Project Mercury, it was named after Mercury. Of course, now the Roman mythology, Mercury was the messenger god, kind of like their mailman, you could say. But he was known for being really, really fast, which is fitting because planet Mercury, also named accordingly, is both our first planet, but also the fastest planet to orbit the sun. So 1 year on Mercury takes just 88 days. So that's one orbit around the sun. Whereas, of course, here on Earth, 1 year is 365 days, unless it's 2020 and then it's just, forever. But they wanted to be the first and fastest to get to the moon. So that was very, very appropriate that Mercury would be the name for it. So back to the Aurora 7, you could probably tell just by looking at it that, yes, it is not very big. In fact, it only held one astronaut inside of it. So if you said one, you'd be correct. Now, in 1962, the astronaut who went up in the Aurora 7 was named Scott Carpenter. And here he is next to his Mercury Atlas rocket. So that took him all the way up into space. And Scott Carpenter was actually only up in outer space for about 5 hours. He did 3 orbits around the Earth before then very safely splashing down into the Atlantic Ocean. They figured water would be a nice kind of softer landing surface than on, in a desert. But if something this big is going to land in the ocean, NASA still needs to go pick him up, right? They can't just leave your astronaut stranded in the middle of the ocean. So they sent out a helicopter to rescue him. But when they got to the place he was supposed to be, they couldn't find him. And that is because when he was up there wrapping up his mission in space, Scott Carpenter had gotten just a little distracted by one of his experiments, and he ended up firing his re-entry thrusters 2 seconds too late. And as a result, all of that speed and all of those 2 seconds really added up, and they ended up splashing down over 200 miles off course. Well, fortunately, everything was fine. They were able to track him down. He was great. He was just out there sunbathing. He even offered some food to one of the divers who came to pick him up. So that was good. But they ended up then flying him to the closest airport that was in the water, which just happened to be our floating airport, the aircraft carrier, the Intrepid. So here he is actually on board the ship. These are some photos from our collection. There he is surrounded by officers and onlookers on the flight deck of our Intrepid after being picked up from the capsule in 1962. So a very, very momentous occasion. And so, ladies and gentlemen, this is the reason why we are a space museum. So the Intrepid played a very important role in retrieving astronauts and their capsules after they returned from outer space. So there you go. Now, before we move on and get to, the main thing we're going to be talking about today, some space food, I just want to see if we have any questions about the space race. So feel free to ask in the chat if you do. And I'll just point out one more thing, actually, before we get to this. If you look at those pictures, I'll make it a little bigger for you. You can see Scott Carpenter walking around the decks there. On the picture on the right, you can see he's wearing a pretty sweet pair of Cons. I always like to point that out. So see, even astronauts wear sneakers. They are just like us. All right, my friends. So do we have any questions? Let's go. Any questions at all? How long were the Mercury missions? So they were pretty short. Again, we were just testing out the waters here. And, we just wanted to see if we could sustain life up there before venturing to the moon. So that trip took about 2 weeks at a time. But to get there, you had to think about your bodily functions. No one knew what microgravity would do to your body. And actually, there is a funny story that I can tell you about our first American astronaut in space. His name was Alan Shepard. And he was the first to do something else as well. Now, his mission really was just to go up into space and then come right back down. Total trip was 15 minutes. first guy going up there from America. But the problem was once he got into his capsule, he realized he had to go to the bathroom. But again, he figured, it's just 15 minutes. I can probably hold it, not a big deal. But of course, because this was the first time we were sending an American astronaut into space, they wanted to make sure they got it exactly right. There were tons of delays. They were triple checking all of their work, and hours are going by. And eventually he just couldn't hold it anymore. So he called up, ground control, mission control, and he was like, hey, NASA, can I get permission? And they let him pee his pants while he was in his space capsule. So that happened. He came up, he came back down. Everything was great. Everything was fine. But that made NASA realize that they did need to think about how they'd be going to the bathroom over a period of, a couple weeks. And that is what led them to inventing space diapers, basically. They called them maximum absorbency garments. So these are these little steps that you start to learn things about your missions. And, things go wrong sometimes like that. Any other questions? How do astronauts get food supplies while up in space? Yeah, so they actually have to take it with them. Those really early missions were very short, again, so they had to plan ahead, but they weren't going to be up there for long periods of time, so they didn't need a ton of food and supplies anyway. They went up with their experiments. Today on the International Space Space Station, they've got a ton of food up there that they can store. They've got the space to store it. And also because they're up there for so long and people are coming and going, they can send resupply capsules, care packages basically, to stock them up over periods of time. So that's basically how they do it now. But back then, these smaller capsules, they didn't really need that much to take with them. Alrighty, so I mentioned that, and yes, Cynthia, he actually wet his pants. That is true. So, all right, I mentioned that our earliest space missions had a lot of experiments going on, and again, these were just the baby steps. We needed to test everything out first to make sure that this was even a good idea to go up to the moon in the first place. And one of those things that they experimented with, of course, was space food. Now, throughout history, explorers have always had to deal with the availability of food or the lack thereof while they were, on these long expeditions. So maybe they were on a boat, or maybe they were on a camel in the desert, hiking through the wilderness, or, a capsule in space. But the idea of being able to get nutrition so that you didn't develop sicknesses or, scurvy if you're on a boat, right? They had to figure this out for long periods of time because journeys can last a while. And also, of course, you didn't want to have to carry too much with you to burden you down. So that's always been an issue and something they've had to think about. Now, early on, we discovered, of course, that food could be edible for longer periods of time if you dried it out. So people often would cut up, fish or meat or fruits into, strips and dry them out in the sun. So we still eat stuff like that, dried fruits, beef jerky, stuff like that. But later on, we also developed the idea of curing foods. So that's rubbing things with salt to preserve it a bit better. Also, of course, freezing things can make it last longer, and canning, which many people were doing at home while in quarantine too. But not all of these storage solutions work super well for space flight. So once they're up there, they've got limitations to things like weight and volume. If they add a lot of food weight, they're going to have to, compensate with how much rocket power and fuel that they're going to need to launch it up to. So they had to start thinking about what the packaging would be like in a microgravity environment. Things are floating around, and really until more recently, relatively, the lack of refrigeration too up there. So that is where the genius of people at NASA came in. So early on in the space program, even before we sent anyone into space for the first time with the Mercury missions, there was actually some concern about the ability to just eat, to just swallow things in microgravity, and also being able to digest it. What would happen in your body? How could it absorb it once you ate it? And they didn't really know what was going to happen. If everything is floating around you, well, maybe your body can't even move everything through your system like it's supposed to too. So they were a little concerned about how to prepare for that. Also things like temperatures or air pressure or the lack thereof, stuff like that, these little subtle vibrations in the spacecraft, they didn't know. So they had to consider all of these things, plus the weight, and of course, the fact that you are now in these teeny tiny little capsules. Now, the earliest days of the space program, Project Mercury, our flights really only ranged from a few minutes to about a day. So they didn't really need too much food again, and often they started off just by eating on the ground first before going into space. So here is a photo of John Glenn, one of our first American astronauts, having breakfast on the morning of his very first historic Mercury flight, where he became the first American to orbit the Earth. So that means go around it. And this has actually really become a tradition now for the astronauts to have one last really big meal on Earth before their mission. Because, once those early astronauts would go up, they would be doing a lot of food testing on those flights. So simple things like chewing or drinking and swallowing both solid and liquid food while they were in microgravity. So the earliest food systems up there on the Mercury flights were similar to military survival rations or, what hikers might take on a long trip. And they had to provide a lot of nutrition, but in a very small container. So John Glenn, the first man to eat in space from America here, first American man, and in this picture you can see him there. He's got this tube kind of thing that's kind of sticking out of a toothpaste container there. It's like a straw coming out of it, floating next to him on the left. And that's basically what he ate. That's what he ate out of. On that historic mission, he had applesauce in a tube that you can see on the left there, as well as pureed beef and vegetables from the tube on the right. Yeah, so he said he did find it pretty easy to eat in microgravity, but he also complained that the menu was a little too limited. So, maybe have a little more variety there. That was a joke, clearly. Now, everyone, as we go through the history of space food, I do want you to pay special attention, in particular, to the beef and vegetables, okay? So this has historically been a pretty popular meal over the years that many of the astronauts have enjoyed, but you're going to be able to track now how this has progressed as we move through time. So make a little mental note of that. You've got your beef and vegetables in a toothpaste tube. Alrighty. But yeah, so these first Mercury astronauts, they found themselves eating this pureed paste that they would, either suck through a straw or just squeeze right into their mouths from these tubes, these aluminum tubes here. On the left, you can also see we've got some bananas. And on the right, clam chowder. Yum. As well as up in the top right, you've got some dehydrated, so all the water has been sucked out, and compressed bite-sized cubes of food. There's going to be a lot more of this. Now, here is another idea of some dehydrated stuff that they used on Mercury. So on the right side, on the top, we have some bread substitute bites. So basically kind of like croutons. Also some cookies and chocolate wafers in tubes and some apricot bites. And also in the rest of this photo, you can see a number of dehydrated powders that could be kind of reconstituted with a bit of water, just like pudding mix, basically. So on the top row, you've got things like chicken and cocoa and grape nuts in this dehydrated milk powder. We still have milk powder, of course, in the stores today. And on the bottom, there's actually banana pudding, beef and gravy, and some juice powders. Yeah, so little baggies here. Now, here's another photo of some dehydrated Mercury foods. We've got some strawberries on the top left. You've got pears on the top right. You've got mushroom soup on the bottom. And, wait for it, beef and vegetables. There we go. So now we have graduated from pureed goo in a tube to a freeze-dried log. Doesn't that look so appetizing? Yum, yum. So this next photo here actually shows the mechanism for connecting a water dispenser to the food containers that I just showed you. Each portion was individually packaged in those, flexible, transparent little plastic baggies. And it had a water injection port on the top. So after the water was injected into the package from the pouch, they would kind of mash it all up. They would knead it all together. And then eventually just kind of suck it out of the top. They would squeeze it out kind of like you have Go-Gurt, that yogurt in the little tubes. So, or even kind of like a popsicle, you kind of like slide it up. That's how they would eat it. They'd suck it out through these little plastic pouches. And of course, the plastic didn't weigh too incredibly much. So that was a little bit of a better alternative than those aluminum tubes. But overall, the food, wasn't very appetizing. And they also kept running into some problems when they tried to rehydrate the powders. They didn't really fully, dissolve. So fortunately, though, the Mercury missions weren't that long anyway. So food wasn't super essential for survival. But I did mention that the Intrepid picked up the Aurora 7 capsule, right? That wasn't the only one that we picked up. We also picked up this one a little later. So this next series of missions were the Gemini missions. And these were named Gemini, of course, after the constellation Gemini, the twins, the zodiac sign Gemini as well, because it was the first time, as you can see in this picture here, that NASA sent two astronauts up into space together inside of a capsule. So it is a little bit bigger than the Mercury capsule that we just looked at. And on board Gemini 3 here, we had Gus Grissom and John Young. So these two astronauts went up into outer space. They also orbited around the Earth 3 times and then eventually splashed down into the Atlantic Ocean. And then were retrieved, of course, by the Intrepid. Now, here on the left is actually a picture of the Intrepid retrieving the Gemini capsule from the ocean in 1965. I do love this photo because you can see all of the sailors lined up along the edge of the boat there, looking on. They're so excited to see him. And then, of course, retrieving that capsule from the water as well. And if you happen to come by the Intrepid Museum, we have a replica of this exact moment of the capsule in this yellow floaty being lifted up with a crane onto the flight deck there too. So check that out. But, some of the later Gemini missions were much longer. They were up to 2 weeks at a time. So this was when some major advancements in space food were born. So NASA teamed up with the Whirlpool Corporation. Now, that is the company you might have heard of. They make a lot of, refrigerators and washing machines and stuff. They worked with them as well as with the Army because, of course, the Army had been making survival rations for a number of years. And they started to develop new food and better packaging, too. And so the first thing to go, of course, were those aluminum squeeze tubes. First of all, because they were just disgusting, but also because the tubes themselves ended up weighing more than the food inside of them. That made no sense for them to be carrying all of that extra weight up. So they had to go. Now, NASA knew that if they weren't packaged properly as well, foods that would be floating around in microgravity could also break up and they could damage some of the equipment on board, or even worse, they could be inhaled. So you don't want to be able to, you don't have to breathe in these crumbs and stuff. So they then started to work with the Pillsbury company, with like the Pillsbury Doughboy, in order to develop this kind of edible gelatin layer that they would start putting all over these loose foods in order to reduce crumbs from the dehydrated bits of food there. And these foods were also then vacuum sealed into individual plastic pouches for easy storage. And in this image here on the top left, you can see we've got some date fruit cake. We've got brownies. We have apricot cereal cubes and also some strawberry cubes. So when I think of strawberries, I don't necessarily think of dehydrated cubes of strawberries. Although, sometimes in cereal, they have those little dehydrated strawberry bits. Those are actually pretty good if you add milk and everything. But I want like a juicy strawberry. I don't know if I want these little cubes. But again, covering these already dehydrated cubes with gelatin, it doesn't really, sound very appetizing, does it? And some of the astronauts didn't think so either. So there is actually an infamous story that we like to tell about the Gemini 3 mission in 1965, which was one of the missions that the Intrepid picked up, and I showed you those images earlier. So again, on board Gemini 3, there were 2 astronauts, Gus Grissom and John Young. And one of the experiments that they were tasked with on this 5-hour mission was to sample 2 meal packages. And the one you see on screen here is actually one of them. One of these meals here, it was dehydrated beef pot roast on the left. You can see that the hands kind of injecting some water there. You have orange juice, you have toasted bread cubes, and bacon and egg bites, and a wet wipe. Although, of course, you're not supposed to eat the wet wipe, obviously. Well, 2 days before the launch, fellow astronaut and practical joker Wally Schirra stopped by a place called Wolfie's Restaurant and Sandwich Shop in Cocoa Beach, Florida, nearby Cape Kennedy. So this was a popular hangout spot located in the Ramada Inn, a little hotel nearby where all the astronauts were working. But he happened to, as a joke, pick up a corned beef sandwich. And right before launch, he handed it to John Young as a joke because he knew he was going to be testing out some of this gross food. Well, John kept that sandwich. In fact, he smuggled it up with him into space by hiding it in his spacesuit. And once they got into orbit, he pulled out the sandwich and he took a bite. He even offered some to his friend Gus. And there they were. They ate the first corned beef sandwich in space. Now, there is just one little problem. If you eat a sandwich here on Earth, you got crumbs, right? We have gravity though, so here at least they can go down, but in space they're going to float everywhere. And so that is exactly what happened. There was no gelatin layer on this one. And so it's actually, again, very dangerous because, like I said, those crumbs could have gotten lodged in their equipment, or they could have breathed them in or gotten it into their eyes or something. So, of course, those astronauts very quickly realized, okay, that was meant to be a joke, but it's actually a really bad idea. So they put it away. But NASA had heard every word of their conversation. So those astronauts got in a lot of trouble when they came back home. They didn't lose their jobs, but they did have to publicly apologize to Congress, a little embarrassing, who, of course, was furious with them because they were wasting time and money and they weren't eating all of this fancy experimental food that they had sent them up with in the first place. But this situation, kind of like, Alan Shepard peeing his pants, actually did help NASA to think a little bit more about an issue they hadn't thought about, this issue of crumbs, right? And also thinking about what other types of food maybe they should and shouldn't take up on those early flights. So now, if an astronaut wants to eat a sandwich in space, they can't use bread. They have to use tortillas instead because they are flat packed and they don't really make crumbs the same way. Now, you're probably wondering, what are we looking at right here? What is this? Well, this is actually, funny enough, this is a tribute to that infamous corned beef sandwich. It is an actual corned beef sandwich that has been memorialized in resin at the Gus Grissom Memorial Museum in Indiana. So Congress may not have thought it was very funny, but we all certainly do, and so did the museum. So this is just a fun little thing they have on display there. So shout out to the Gus Grissom Memorial Museum in Indiana. Now, almost 2 decades later, John Young, who you can see floating upside down here, became the first commander of the space shuttle. And at that point, the food had progressed quite a bit. So, you know what he ate for lunch while he was in space? Any guesses? Corned beef. Yep, all properly irradiated and sealed this time. So they were able to figure it out. And there he had, of course, a little honor to his earlier hijinks on that capsule. But back to Gemini, everyone. Water was actually produced on board as a byproduct of fuel cell operation. So it was great. They didn't have to bring it up with them, and they could actually inject their food with this little hose you can see on the right. So this is kind of the just add water, dehydrated foods here. And it really did give them a lot more options and cut down on the weight of bringing the extra water with them. So in this picture, you can get a sense of what it might have been like at mealtime. You've got strawberry cubes that, you covered in gelatin. You just pop it in your mouth. The beef there is now also reconstituted in that bag with water. So it doesn't look too appetizing, but, you close your eyes. Sometimes, you just taste it and maybe it tastes better. But some other food that was flown on later Gemini missions were things like cinnamon toasted bread cubes. You can kind of imagine what that might have actually been. You've got chocolate cubes. You've got cream of chicken soup. You've got turkey and gravy, and even also shrimp cocktail. Now, as time went on, of course, they made a number of additional changes, mainly because they realized that the food wasn't as nutritionally balanced as they wanted. And also the food preparation took a lot of time and effort. And sometimes the meals themselves didn't really taste super great because the water they were using from the fuel cells also had some dissolved gases in it. So maybe not the cleanest thing to be eating. And also, again, same problem as with Mercury. Sometimes the things just didn't really constitute properly. So still an experiment in progress, but certainly making much more advancements as we were moving on to the Gemini missions. Caroline, you said, did the water taste okay? No, it had kind of like a gasoline taste to it. There were some things in it that tasted a little bit off. And also, they only had cold water and room temperature water. So all these meats and things, you're eating cold meats. All right, so let me pause here and see if we have any other questions. Any other questions? How do astronauts eat when they are in their spacesuits on spacewalks? Yeah, so astronaut suits actually have pouches inside for water, and they've got straws, just like you saw John Glenn with the straw that they could drink from. And they've even got a little like snack bar thing. It's kind of like a power bar sort of in the helmets of their suit that they can just sort of lean into. So if they've got their straw, they can just sort of like lean over and suck out of the straw, or like lean over and eat the little power bar. Because again, if you're out in space, you can't really get your hand up in there because you got to have that seal. So it has to all be reachable by just sort of leaning their heads one way or another. But they have, some availability to do that. Fortunately, they're not usually in their spacesuits for super long periods of time, though. So, if they want to eat something, they can do it before they go out or right when they come back in. All right, any other questions? Do astronauts get to pick their own food when they go into space? So, actually, starting with the Gemini missions, they could start to pick what foods they wanted to eat. Or again, originally, they just needed to test out different types of food. They worked from, you think of this like the life cycle of a human. You start off with just like applesauce and baby food, right? And then eventually you work your way up to hard foods. So they did have a standard menu that was offered, but then they were able to swap out some things and pick off of a list of foods, kind of a la carte. And it actually, in fact, again, one of the most popular dishes right here was shrimp cocktail because of specifically the cocktail sauce. So when you go into space, again, it's microgravity, everything's floating around, but also the fluids in your body start to sort of shift around as well. And so a lot of them kind of start to move up into your head and your nasal passages and things. And if you think of it kind of like when you're sick or you're congested, when you have a cold, you're kind of stuffed up. And so that is the feeling that the astronauts often report that they get when they're in space. So when that happens, oftentimes, maybe you can relate to this. If you're sick, if you're congested, you can't really taste foods that well. And that has to do with your taste buds and the way the fluids are, moving around in your mouth and everything. So they have reportedly said that they really like spicy food while they are up in space because they can really taste it even after all that fluid shift. So of course, cocktail sauce, it's got that horseradish in it. So that is a very spicy and tangy thing that they love. And they still do love it to this day. That's still a very, very popular one. Great question. All right. So by the time we got to the Apollo program, then, so this is now after Gemini, the quality and the variety of the food increased even further. So the first manned Apollo mission, so this was now Apollo 7, had actually 96 food items available. They had really started to expand the menu. Astronauts on the Apollo missions were actually also the first to have hot water and also cleaner this time. So it wasn't necessarily, having that extra flavor of gas to it, which made rehydrating foods easier and also really improved the taste because it wasn't just room temperature stuff. So now for the first time, they could have hot meals. And so this image that you see here is kind of a smattering of different foods that they had. And, some of them are recognizable. Up on the top right, actually, that's scrambled eggs, believe it or not. All sorts of different things that they had here. But some of the earlier packages, again, were just these, plastic tube pouches that they would eat out of. We saw that astronaut sucking one with a straw there, or like a plastic tube. But eventually, a number of foods were changed into this new spoon bowl package. So this on the left is chicken and rice. This flew up on Apollo 11. So that's the one that landed on the moon. And of course, you can see now it is a plastic container that could be hydrated through a little valve on one side on the left there, and then opened with a zip top on top. And then its contents could just, be eaten out just like a bowl with a spoon. So it's just imagine like you're eating out of like, a zip top bag basically with a spoon. And on the right, it's the same idea. This is labeled as spiced fruit cereal. So you can probably guess what that is. And it's also got dehydrated milk powder inside of it too. So if I had to guess, yeah, it's probably like Apple Jacks and milk for breakfast. And then, of course, we can see our Apollo progressions onto none other than beef with vegetables. Kind of still looks similar, that dehydrated log at first, but check this out. Now you've got your spoon bowl and you add water and well, bam, there you go. Looks a little more appetizing. So now you can eat it with a spoon instead of slurping it out with a straw. Great advancement there. It actually doesn't look too bad. I mean, I'd like it on a plate or in a bowl, but it is a bowl. It's a spoon bowl. There you go. So also incidentally, actually, in case you were wondering, the first NASA meal that was eaten on the moon was bacon bars, peaches, sugar cookie cubes, coffee, and a pineapple grapefruit drink. So nothing too fancy. Just, just the basic stuff that they needed in order to survive there. But some of the other foods that were consumed on board Apollo were things like this. We had coffee, or I mentioned that already. We had cheese crackers. There were also things like sausage patties, scrambled eggs. We pointed that out earlier. On here, you can see peanut cubes. They also had things like tuna salad and spaghetti and meat sauce. Beef pot roast, again, was a thing. So up on the top right, there's the sugar cookie cubes, chocolate pudding down on the bottom in a little spoon bowl. There's those bacon bars. And then also they had, look at this, hot dogs, Frankfurters. And these were all sealed up and irradiated in order to protect them from bacteria. That basically means that they kind of shoot radiation at it to kill the bacteria, and they have it all sealed up. So they had whole sorts of things like, different kinds of meats, steaks and things like that that had been irradiated and were sealed up, and then they could just add some hot water to it, and they could have a nice little hot meal there. So hot dogs were something else that they had, which, some variety. Variety is the spice of life. Now, later on with the shuttle missions, which were after Apollo, of course, we stopped. Once we got to the moon, we landed successfully on the moon. NASA decided to, focus a little bit more on low Earth orbit, stay a little closer to home. They wanted to put some things like satellites and telescopes up into our low Earth orbit in order to look out and see a little bit further, because we'd accomplished our goal, but we wanted to learn a little bit more about what was beyond that from the safety of home. So we had the space shuttle, of course. I will add that we have the first space shuttle. You can see behind me here, the Space Shuttle Enterprise, the prototype orbiter of the space shuttles. We have that here at the Intrepid Sea, Air, and Space Museum, so please do come check it out in our Space Shuttle Pavilion up on the flight deck. But this was a little different. They were a little bit bigger. They could fit 7 or 8 people on board, and the majority of it behind me here is actually empty. This is just like a large space truck, effectively. It just has a large cargo bay where they would put things like telescopes and satellites in it. So once they launched up into space, they'd open up the doors and, let it out, and now it's still floating around up in outer space. So these were a little different. They had a lot more space, which meant they could bring up different types of food. And the food, of course, advanced even further from there. And now you're starting to get into a little bit more normal types of food and the things that they actually kind of eat on the International Space Station as well. So here are a few of the different types of foods that they have. So first of all, of course, we still have the rehydratable foods. So these are the freeze-dried foods that, all the water's been sucked out of them, and then they add water to it later, whether that be cold or hot water. And then, that's also things, you'd have like soups or the scrambled eggs, right? But then we also have things called intermediate moisture foods. So these have some water in it. They're not entirely dried out. So that would be stuff like, dried fruits, like apricots, that you can see here on the left. You've also got natural form foods. So these are things that have just a really long shelf life already. So stuff like nuts and candies and condiments and things like that. No problem taking those up. Of course, you want to make sure you eat them all and get them in your mouth, not, lodge them in little cabinets or something up there. Then you also have thermostabilized foods. So this is stuff that has been exposed to heat to kill the bacteria. And that stuff, that's like canned foods or pudding cups, for example. And that's actually a very common thing that they still eat up there as well. And that's in addition then to this irradiated sort of meat situation that I talked about. Now, I know that we have covered a ton of food so far, but there's probably something that you're just dying to hear about. Why haven't I mentioned this yet? This is what we came to know about. What is the deal with astronaut ice cream, right? So it's this wacko idea of food in space. This has become such a novelty at this point that, people think it's so popular, right? In gift shops, everyone buys this stuff. It's so weird to eat. I remember as a kid, I was obsessed with getting this stuff. It's just so bizarre. It's so dry. If you've ever had it, it's like chalky and like crumbly and like just it never, when you open it up, it's never in one piece. It's always broken up into a billion pieces. And first of all, I can tell you a very terrible secret about astronaut ice cream, and probably related to the way I just described it. Astronaut ice cream and ice cream sandwiches, stuff like this, it never went into space. Now, the main reason actually is just that they didn't like it. But also, as I just described, it's messy, right? It's crumbly. It is just chalky and powdery. it's going to be a disaster in microgravity environment, remember? Now, freeze-dried ice cream cubes were actually developed for early Apollo missions by Whirlpool, but they never made it on board. And there is actually a press release about the Apollo 7 mission that listed vanilla ice cream as a dessert on board the ship. But Walt Cunningham, or when I say sorry, ship the capsule, but Walt Cunningham, who was the sole surviving astronaut from that mission, he actually has confirmed numerous times that ice cream, he did not remember having it on there. It was never on the menu. So there is a little conspiracy about that, maybe, but to everyone's knowledge, that actually never happened. However, I will say in 2006, a freezer was flown aboard the space shuttle in order to store research samples. And they figured, all right, we're sending up this freezer. It's supposed to be empty now anyway. Why don't we go ahead and give them some ice cream? So they sent up this freezer with the real thing inside of it. So they had those little individually portioned ice cream cups in space, and they were able to eat it as soon as it got up there, so it didn't go bad. And there you go. So there was actually some ice cream in space, but it didn't look anything like this. All right, my friends. So I want to thank you all so much for tuning in today to Snacking in Space. Hopefully you learned a little something cool today. But I do want to see if there are any final questions as we round out the program. So what you got? Let's see. Can they make their own food in space now? So actually, yes, we have successfully grown vegetables in space. This has been a long time thing that they've been studying. So the effects of microgravity and solar radiation on growing plants, vegetables, and things, because of course NASA wants to someday send people to Mars, right? So this is going to be important. This idea of sustainability and hydroponic planting, which is when you take a plant and you put it in nutrient dense water, so without soil, just the water, and well, since Martian soil is so much different than we have here on Earth, you're going to need something like that because you can't really send potting soil up. That would be so heavy as well. So the plants can actually grow just in water in outer space. So far they've grown things like lettuce and tomatoes and potatoes, I believe. So if you're into salads and stuff, yeah, you're good to go. But the rest of it is brought up. However, I will add that in January, this past recent January, for the first time, they did bake cookies in space. This was a huge experiment. The DoubleTree Hotel actually sponsored this experiment. They're the company that has the little cookies on your pillows, when you go in there. They sent up chocolate chip cookie dough, and they made a 0G oven designed to work in space. But what's really interesting is that they sent them up with instructions on how to use it, but they came out really underbaked when they followed the directions. So they had to experiment, 3, 4, 5 times, and they ultimately found that the sweet spot for baking these cookies was 2 hours, 2 hours at a time. Which, if you put cookies in the oven for 2 hours now, it's gonna disintegrate. It's gonna be totally baked and just burnt. So that's either either the oven was just calibrated incredibly wrong, or maybe microgravity does something to the way things bake. They actually had to bake them in special pouches too, because otherwise the dough would sort of float around in the oven. All of these things you have to think about. So they're still sort of testing that out too. And I'd kind of like to taste what space cookies taste like. I'm curious about that. So yes, they do make their own food in space now, for sure. All right. So everyone, again, thank you so much for tuning in today. If you do have any other questions about our programs, you can feel free to reach out to us through our website, intrepidmuseum.org, or also through our social media platforms. And I'd like to thank you all again so much for watching, sharing your questions, your comments today. Do be sure to follow or subscribe to this channel and visit our website for our upcoming programs as well. Speaking of which, our next one is going to be this coming Thursday at 3 p.m. We are going to be doing high flying design, where we are going to talk a whole bunch about airplanes on an aircraft carrier and how they're able to fly. Another very, interesting mystery of life. How are things able to fly? So I would also like to mention finally that our museum has reopened to the public. So do come by and visit us. We are open Thursdays through Sundays from 10 to 5 p.m. So if you're in the area, come by, check out some cool things. Stuff like the Enterprise behind me here that we have on display. Alrighty, so thank you all again so much for joining us, and hopefully we will be able to see you for an upcoming program. Thanks so much, everyone. See you next time.